Hey, what's up, ReFi Nation? Simar here with my dear friend, John Ellison. We just finished recording an amazing episode with the Spirals Protocol. Helena and Doug had such an amazing conversation. John, what are some of the things that you're taking away after having, the past hour with them?
Yeah, man, I think they're just quintessential ReFi in every sense of the term. They're totally the embodiment of the hope and promise of this movement. People who deeply care about the planet but have great technical capability and have narrowed in on a specific niche. The Celo ecosystem is vibrant, values-based, mission-driven, and they're a really core part of it. And so it was great hearing that they met in ReFi DAO and seeing how they've been collaborating together and how they just give to so many people. And really excited to see the protocol continue to grow. And I think it was a great conversation, quite technical at times. There's a lot of concepts thrown around. I feel like it's probably good to just unpack the core term of like what staking is and why it's relevant. I know you've got probably a better technical background. Do you just want to open that up a little bit for listeners before we dive into the episode?
Yeah, totally. And just to sort of, add a little bit more color. So Spirals is basically using yield generated from staking to be able to basically direct that flow towards climate positive projects. And staking in particular, and for those who are just coming into the space, within blockchain, we need to have a consensus mechanism in a way to be able to verify transactions and put them on blocks. Historically, blockchains like Bitcoin have done through what we call a proof of work mechanism, in which, basically computers are running computation and solving computational puzzles as quote unquote proof of work to then verify transactions, then put them on blocks. We're seeing in a far more energy efficient way this movement towards proof of stake, which is far more efficient. Actually it increases the speed at which we can verify transactions and create new blocks. And it's just, far more effective. And so basically with staking, validators are putting up some amount of native capital for that particular chain, saying, hey, this is verified, like we are verifying that these transactions are true and accurate, and then putting that up. And in the case that they are bad actors, their capital, what they've staked, gets slashed. So it's an incredibly robust and resilient mechanism. And you're seeing in the space more and more movement towards proof of stake based mechanisms, which, and for many layer one protocols are offering yield on top of staked assets. And so it's opening up this new dimension of capital flows that can now be redirected and moved towards anything that we see fit. And I think Spirals is doing an amazing job really catering to, hey, how do we move this yield that's being generated towards, assets and projects that are beneficial for the environment and for nature. Enough preamble on my side. Here's the episode, everyone. So excited for you all to listen. Let us know what you think. Here we go. Hey, good morning, Helena, Doug. Great to have you guys on today. How are you guys both doing?
Amazing. So excited to be here. Thanks so much for having us on.
Yeah. Same here. Good morning.
John and I have been, we've been prepping all week. We're so excited to have you guys on, talk, deep dive into Spirals, talk a little bit more about your guys' journeys, and just be here together and just jam. John, anything else you want to add as we kick this off?
I think just to be grateful for everything you guys are doing in the ecosystem and have a chance to dive deeper into what you're up to. I think starting off at a high level in terms of like what you guys are doing, moving on to your theory of change, and then getting into, some of the stuff you've learned along the way and maybe some more like recent developments. I know there was a little bit of a tease about some exciting stuff you've been working on with Climate Collective. But let's start at the top for people who haven't had the pleasure of digging through your materials. What is Spirals Protocol? I'll kick that one off to you, Helena.
Yeah, what is Spirals? We're very much still working on our one-liner. So quick little request for the audience. If you have a better one, we are very open to it. I think right now it feels very jargon heavy, and if you're not ReFi native, it might not make any sense. So please call me out on this. But the current one-liner for Spirals is regenerative financing of climate impact. And there's a lot of words there to unpack. I think the first one is regenerative, which people on this podcast probably are familiar with. And then financing, because a huge part of what we do is we finance projects. So we're capturing yield in a lot of unrealized places, redirecting that into the most high impact climate projects out there, and have some fun game mechanics and incentive design to make that kind of flow a lot faster than existing carbon markets.
We're looking to, I guess, find creative ways to plug in a lot of the capital and liquidity that exists in Web3, and to create some interesting incentive models behind funding some really high impact climate projects. And I'm curious if you guys are interested in hearing kind of like the story of how we met each other. Yeah. I'll let Helena start that off.
Kick things off. So I was running another startup, very deep in Web 2 land, building a video chat company. And it was December of last year. So pretty recent. I was like pretty anti-crypto, honestly. Not anti-crypto, but just hadn't bought into any of the degen kind of tokenomic schemes, and kept being told by my friends that blockchain was more than just degens, more than NFTs, that you could actually build systemic change, that you could kind of innovate on policy at the pace of tech. And I was like, how does any of this work? This doesn't make any sense to me. It's a decentralized database. Like, it's a cool technology, but why is this revolutionary? Why is this interesting? So for me, my journey into crypto land was very much going super deep down into the infra layer, because for me to understand why this was so exciting, I just had to kind of unpack everything. So I started looking into what was actually signing blocks on the blockchain, which were validators. And this was very much just me geeking out and nerding out on a system level, to try to understand what was driving all the hype. And pretty quickly realized this really interesting thing with validators that now has turned into kind of like one of the first ways we're capturing yield for spirals. And at the time, I thought the hardest part of running a validator was going to be getting it operating and signing blocks correctly. But turns out that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is attracting people to vote for you. Because unlike in proof of work, where every single node automatically gets yield, or is able to mint blocks, validators need to basically run elections. They need to convince people that they're the best machine out there, which I found hilarious because they're all the same. So what can you actually kind of compete on beyond uptime? And all of them pretty much have like good uptime. So that struck me as odd, and it struck me mostly as odd because none of these validators were attempting to market themselves at all. So the idea was super simple. I was still busy running my previous startup, and now I was running a validator. I was like, all right, how can I make mine more attractive? Let me just give away all the profits to good. So that was like, it just sat there. And that was interesting. A lot of people got really excited by that because they weren't currently voting at all. So now they were able to earn funds while voting for a validator that pretty much was helping the planet. Fast forward a few, weeks or months, and I had decided to sell my previous company and shut down all the validator business. I was like, I clearly was distracted and not in love with my previous company anymore, but I want to work in climate, like full time. Like, I don't want to run a tiny like validator nonprofit. Like, I need to go solve climate from like a first principles perspective, and started mapping out carbon markets. And just made this massive Figma board, trying to understand all the complexities of like Vera and, project developers and how this all kind of pieced in. And just kept throwing things on there. And I was like very active on Twitter, sharing this around. And that's kind of where I met Doug. I'll pass the baton to you, Doug.
Yeah. And so that's where I ended with the picture. I found that Figma file, and I remember the first time I found that Figma file, I opened it on my phone, and it was zoomed in on this like hand-drawn diagram of the bottlenecks in the carbon market. And it was, the hand drawings were it wasn't that good, right? And I was like, come on. I basically just closed it the first time I saw it. The first time I saw that Figma file, I was like, I'll look at this later. And I never got back to it. And then one day I was actually poking around the ReFi Discord, and Helena had replied to somebody else saying, hey, new to this industry, wonder if there's any like materials you can share. And she replied again with this Figma link, and I clicked on it again on my laptop. And this time I saw it like, on my monitor, like fully blown up. And I was like, holy crap, there's a lot of stuff here. And it's a lot of the same things that I've been looking at. So I just started dumping my thoughts. And it was like, absurd. Like I should have commented, but I was leaving my own stickies, and it was like almost like you doubled the board. Um, and then that's when we took the conversation to Twitter, and we're like, hey, like, let's meet up. And then we realized that we were both in San Francisco, so we met up in person. And yeah, that's that story. And I guess a little bit before that, while I was in my own journey, while Helena was running the Solana validator, I was separately exploring kind of Web3 and climate. And so I thought a good way to explore Web3 is like, hey, let's go to ETH Denver, right? Like, let's go to this massive conference. So I went to ETH Denver in 2022, got COVID just like everybody else. But over there, I went to a ReFi meetup, and it was at like my hotel's guest breakfast or something. I was like doing the hackathon at the time. And we made this like token gated, like NFT gated URL sharing service. So that was really fun. But then I was like at my hotel breakfast one day, and I was talking to this guy, Kieran from Return Protocol. And I was like, hey, what do you work on? And he said, regenerative finance. And I was like, what is that? That sounds really interesting. And he said, there's a meetup at this brewery tonight. You should come. And I was like, where can I learn more? And he just sent me the docs for Toucan Protocol. And I read the whole thing, and I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. I never knew like Web3 and climate, there's an intersection. I always thought of them as kind of like mutually exclusive things. And so I got really, really excited about that, and then met Helena, and now we're here.
Oh man, I absolutely love that. It might be my favorite ReFi story today. It's just like so Web3, so ecosystem. I love that Kieran's involved, ReFi DAO, Discord. That's just such a joy. And that is literally the reason why I'm here, is to see these connections emerge in spontaneous but profound ways where people can resonate around, shared visions of the future and start building stuff together. So yeah, really glad you kind of exfoliated some of the layers of that story, Doug. And I know you guys have been moving really fast as well. I think, Helena, you got your weeks and months confused a little bit earlier. You guys definitely run a high tempo. But give us a sense of after you all met, I know you launched recently. What's the timeline been? What did you release as a product? What was the kind of hypothesis there? And what have you all learned from then on?
Yeah, so speaking of moving fast in crypto land, one of the hardest things has been what parts can you kind of scope out and release later. And for us, there was a natural point where we could launch an MVP for the staking piece without having to entirely launch our tokenomics and having to launch necessarily the end-to-end funding of projects. So right now we're in a stage where validators can redirect their yield to our protocol, and individual delegators can also stake with our protocol, and they can also kind of give up some of their yield. And we will be airdropping governance to them retroactively once that's launched. And through this, we can kind of start bootstrapping, the demand side and building up all our partnerships while we're at the same time building up our list of projects and ReFi protocols. So we're in a position where we are actually able to work in a non-competitive, positive sum game with all different types of ReFi protocols and have them kind of just link up with our ecosystem. We like to say that we're kind of planet and member owned. Our protocol doesn't take fees. The entire governance goes back to every ReFi protocol that works with us, in addition to our climate committee that's helping to do this light audit, which happy to kind of also walk through end to end the user journey of a project, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and we also we started this journey. We applied to a Climate Collective grant. And we made a decision early on that we wanted to build the MVP on Celo, because we saw, a bunch of the ReFi ecosystem moving to Celo this summer. And now we found ourselves both very physically and spiritually, I guess, embedded within Celo. We work out of the Celo office in SF every single day. Shout out to Elise, Nikhil, all the good folks there. We also have been building a lot of things with the C Labs team. So we merged a few PRs for Celo Safe, which is the Gnosis Safe fork for multi-sigs on Celo, for Celo CLI. So it's been a really, really just good time overall. We're really glad we chose Celo to kind of be the home for Spirals, the home base. And I also know that Simar, you're an early investor in Celo. So it's just funny how the story clicks on so many levels.
That is amazing. I feel like John mentioned this, but this is truly, I feel like your story and everything as you've built is truly an epitome of so much of what I feel like Web3 is about. The connections, the coming together, hey, why don't we redefine value in some way, shape, or form and find other people that want to do it with us, and then sort of like keep going from there. It's beautiful to see, and also really cool to see. I think to your point, like how you can really great. Like there's these flows of capital that are coming through yield. How can we start to direct them towards high climate? Like there's a set of people that really care about that. How can we really bring that into the fray? And so I'd love to hear. We can talk about. One of the things John and I also talk about that's always fun is like there's always there's the content of what all the things that we're building. And one of the things we found with Cello and Cello Connect, because John and I met actually for the first time this year at Cello Connect when we were in Barcelona, and it's like there's always the personal journeys too that like come about as you're coming along. And so that's one thing we've always had fun riffing on. And it's cool to see here too, like another sort of way in which like Cello's created a home base for all of us to come together. But on the protocol side, for you guys, how do you guys think about, because you guys are in a position where you get to really determine what projects and what kinds of, are going to be receiving the yield and, the sort of economic flows that you guys are tapping into. How do you think about what are high value climate, impact projects? And, just give us a little bit more of a glimpse into how you think about that process.
Yeah, totally. I think there's two large things to touch on here. Well, how do you think about impact? So one, we as a Spiral's core team don't actually make those decisions. We have an entire committee of climate experts who kind of range in being general versus being hyper specific, and they kind of make the final decisions around which types of projects, we call them project pools, are kind of whitelisted to receive funding. So Doug and I are passionate about the planet. We are not experts, nor are we scientists. So we found not only for us, but I think anyone designing something like this, it's super important to like not kind of be the ruler of who gets funding. And this kind of makes it a system that's kind of expertly advised, but community funded, because anybody can contribute and kind of gain from upside, but they have these like guardrails of making sure anything they contribute to is going to make a massive impact. But it still gives people choice, right? So let's say we have product with whales and a product with like seagrass. Anybody contributing could still set their relative allocation across two different projects, but kind of within those protected bounds. But in terms of how the kind of climate committee looks at impact, or the lens that we're kind of assessing this world through, I mean, I guess taking a step back from that, we have like three like large, I guess, pillars around thinking about solving the climate crisis as a whole. The first is just like carbon, preventing emissions, right? That's pretty obvious. The second is like pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that's also seemingly obvious. The third one is systemic change. And I think the first two get a lot of attention. And the first two are kind of what carbon markets are for. If carbon markets work and, everybody races to get to net zero and like everyone offsets all of their emissions, wonderful. Assuming all the other flaws in carbon markets are solved, the first two are solved, but that still gets us like very short from solving the climate problem, because we need systemic change where we do more than offsetting our footprint. And the carbon market falls short there for a few reasons. One, because it's carbon reductionist. And the second is because it maxes out at, people claiming all their offsets. So we kind of like to position ourselves in that kind of third bucket where we're not looking at necessarily offsetting the most carbon per se. We've been looking a lot at, how do we increase the scope and look at eco credits more holistically? And how do we design incentives to reward for that? How do we design incentives that reward for newer types of credit classes that have a lot of co-benefits? And the way we're currently doing it is with a combination of immediate rewards and retroactive rewards. And that is when I think it gets pretty exciting for any degens, because we have this like fun curve style system where you can boost pools and you can get retroactive boosts. And we're about to release kind of our entire documentation on that, which should be pretty fun.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think like another thing that's just been really exciting is that so again, like these projects are selected through the climate committee, right? But we'll have other ways through governance to, for example, fast track a particular application that is in the review process. And once it gets into the other side, we want to make sure that people have a way to learn more about these projects and to get really, really excited about them. And we've talked to a bunch of Vero project developers and people that have either done projects before or are looking to do projects for the first time. And one big gap that we are definitely seeing in this overall fight against the climate crisis is the transition from a project that has good peer-reviewed science that needs a little bit more field data, needs to reach a certain scale of deployment before they can develop a methodology and actually get credit certified against that, right? And so we want to bridge that gap. We want to give projects that activation capital. We want to come in when 10, 20K is actually very meaningful for some of these projects, and do it in kind of a way that's really funding like the frontier of this fight, right? And not just saying, hey, we're only going to come in here once you actually have carbon credits, because we know that journey to get there, including developing your own methodology, is such a long winding one that requires a lot of capital. And the barriers to entry are so high right now that, we talk about this being a supply constrained market. Well, we have to like find ways to kind of unblock, right, the people that are trying to come online and provide that supply. So that's kind of that gap that we saw.
Yeah, I love that focus. I think it takes courage to see where the key interventions are and take into account the element of risk that represents, but also recognize that we have to take risks to create systemic change. And there's going to be things that we learn along the way that help inform our models. But I guess that's the power and beauty of an open system like this, as you can tell, what's working and what isn't. And so I'd be curious to understand more from like a user perspective. Somebody's got a Valora app and they've got some Celo in it. What's the actual process of going through Spirals? What's it like? And how does the flow of capital from my wallet in Valora go through into Spirals all the way through to a project developer? And then all the full life cycle, or really the capital flows of credit issuance, right? Are we talking Web3 credit issuance? Are we talking legacy? Like where does the capital flow to in the system?
Yes, great question. So I'll share what we have now and then what's coming. So now the experience is super simple. You can open our dApp in the Valora app and put your Celo in and click stake. And it'll kind of give you projected impact based on kind of estimated costs of like carbon tons. But those are just projected. And that money is like accruing in a treasury. And then before we deploy it to any projects, we will be launching our governance and allowing you to kind of vote on those projects. But for now, it's really just that. And it's like, it'll take you like 2 seconds if you have Celo in your Valora or in your MetaMask. We do support it on web browsers as well. So basically, but the kind of more end to end once it will be ready. So you have governance, and this is kind of coming from the perspective of, you are somebody who holds Celo and wants to contribute, less so from like the project that might want to kind of get involved. Basically, you contribute and you get governance, and you can lock in that governance to participate more actively in the ecosystem. The funds go into a pool for a specific project, or 2 or 3, depending on how you decide to allocate. So let's say you put 10 Celo in, from that, we are capturing yield. We're only ever touching that yield. So we're not touching your principal investment. You can decide to leave at any point. We're touching that yield, making this like a super kind of safe, in like crypto terms, a super safe investment. And then you get to kind of point that cannon at any of the projects in whatever allocation makes sense to you. Then these projects in these pools, we're operating in forward contracts. So we purchase forward contracts in bulk, and then we let those vest kind of into carbon credits. And then there's realized or unrealized yield, depending on what we choose to do with those credits. Depending on the performance of these pools, we will then retroactively also reward you with governance based on how you voted on them, which then gets you incentivized to kind of do your own research as well to see which projects will have the most net impact kind of beyond just units of carbon credits, and then get rewarded in hindsight as well. And so there's like a few different ways, I guess, of like earning governance. One is like, directly just like getting SPRL tokens. But the second is this like retroactive one. And then if you lock in your governance token, you get the vote escrow governance token, VESPRL, which can be used to create additional incentives around these pools. So you can basically like vote to boost a project to incentivize more people to kind of point their allocation towards that project. So that ends up becoming really interesting if you are a carbon project or a marketplace that wants to list their projects on Spirals. And it creates this like fun game where they point governance at their own projects, incentivizing more people to vote for them.
Wow, that was a lot there.
Yeah, I mean, and then and just like maybe just like unpack maybe some of the some of the pieces, right? Just so we can go step by step. I would love to also. I know you mentioned the climate committee. How is that? Is there a community element to it in terms of selecting who's on the community? I'm curious how that committee that's selecting the projects. Could you just touch a little bit more on that, and we can just go through like the end to end, like drill down into each part of the stack.
Totally. So right now, it's been sourced and vetted by us. And we think that building a full on-chain governance that's just set free could run awry pretty quickly if we don't design it correctly. So that's one of the things that for now we're going to kind of keep pretty centralized, but then we're going to work towards a progressive decentralization where there'll be elections or some kind of nominations. But yeah, so that part is still at TBD.
Cool. Okay. And so when you're staking, you have a set of projects. Is there a default? Is there a way to stake in a way that will just like automatically go into, let's say a basket of projects that are currently existing? So because it seems like there's both the passive component and then there's also an active of like, great, I can really deliberately choose and maybe even also, you mentioned before, determine how much goes into different projects, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yeah, exactly that. So you can either just be passive and say, I want to just point my yield towards Spirals and do impact behind the scenes, or I want to just get really in the weeds and get nerd out on which type of project is gonna make the most impact.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay, that's fun. Yeah, John?
And so is the yield exclusively coming from the validator rewards? So I've staked my Celo into Spirals protocol, that goes to a validator, and then Celo is basically issuing more Celo for that stake. Is that the only source of yield, or are you also looking at deploying towards different lending protocols and, other non-layer one, yield generating assets?
Yeah. So today the Celo staking is functions on top of L1 staking with Celo's proof of stake consensus.
Okay.
Our CUSD staking works under the hood, talks to Moolah, which is a fork of Aave. So it is a decentralized lending provider. And yeah, I think that getting having a revenue split set up with validators is one of many ways. And this actually gets into the partnership that we're working on with the Climate Collective that I know, John, you wanted to talk about today. So maybe I can just start there. So, we, in applying for a Climate Collective grant ourselves, just realized that, with grant money, a lot of the times that money is really just sitting there before, certain milestones are approved and that funding is released to the applicant. And so we want to pilot this new concept, and we're actually in the process of getting those contracts audited, of a staked grant. So by default, the Climate Collective is going to stake the funding while it's getting reviewing applicants and approving them with Celo's L1, generating yield and plugging that directly into this whole system of funding climate impact projects. And when they want to transfer the funds to projects, that can happen. And by default, it's still staked. And projects that want to get the money out, they just have to simply unstake. But we think that that's a very powerful. We think about defaults a lot and the power of them, and we think that the default of funds always being put to use, right, in this very safe way of deploying them, and also by default being contributed towards climate, right, that double whammy, that's really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love that as a focus area. And I know folks like Nirvan are super keen to see every dollar deployed towards maximum benefit. And I'm curious, in looking in that direction, what kind of scale are we talking about here? How much capital is currently staked in the form of Celo? And what kind of yield is that deriving? And therefore, what can we deduce about the kind of size of the market that you guys are targeting here? Just let's talk in the Celo ecosystem before we apply it further afield.
Mm-hmm. I guess first way to answer that is we actually haven't officially opened up the dApp beyond private demos. So everybody that's been onboarded right now has been hand onboarded just so we can get a lot of feedback. And that should be going live relatively soon. And then hopefully we'll get, a more self-service onboarding. Right now it's, I think, 20 something K staked, which has been nice. A lot of good user feedback. And once we and with the Climate Collective, we're also rolling it out in phases. So the first phase, they're not going to stake their $5 million treasury, but we are working kind of towards that. It'll start with them staking our grant, so what we were originally going to receive, and then kind of progressively working to stake more and more grants. And the yield on Celo is around 5%, between 4 and 5%, and then being able to kind of redirect a lot of that directly into impact projects. One thing to kind of also touch on is that the way we kind of see this is like better defaults that redirect yield or just funding into kind of our proof of impact protocol, and then going into purchasing of forwards that then vest into carbon credits, which means that while right now we're working with yield and staking, we're also developing things like 1% for the planet and all sorts of other ways of kind of capturing Celo or yield from other chains directly into the protocol. So it's really just about finding all of the missed opportunities. Like Doug mentioned, like we think obsessively about defaults and where are there poor defaults and improving those incentives, and also look at a lot of things as like where can we improve incentives or build primitives for others to build value-based systems. And that's kind of what like the revenue split on a validator is like. So we like push this like CLI change that allows validators to basically share their revenue with another address. And that sounds super simple, but it wasn't live, right? So the reason this is interesting is because validators can now like verifiably give to something and not be taxed on it because it never hits their wallet in the first place. A lot of validators that were doing good before were kind of earning this as profit and then sending money somewhere, which is great. Like, I'm glad they're doing this, but they're not getting anything out of that, which I guess makes them seem even more amazing. They're not getting any marketing, and they're kind of doing it behind the scenes. It takes them a lot of time. So now it's automatic, and we can show it in these like validator explorers. So when people decide to stake with one, it's just on chain.
It's amazing. I love that transparency. Redirecting it just feels like there's an element of, in our existing, at least monetary system, right? There's like when capital's sitting in a bank, at least it's being, for example, lent out. And I think in crypto, sometimes we're missing it. Like, what do you do with latent capital that's just sitting in wallets? And staking, I think, is a great way. And then also now being able to actually direct it towards climate, like actually net positive, world positive projects. I'm curious, with the, for example, let's say forwards that generate, let's say, carbon credits, what happens to those credits? Like the actual, let's say you guys are generating through the project that you're funding new kinds of assets. What happens to those? Do those go back into the treasury and support the governance token? What's that sort of tail end of the loop look like?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, you're going to end up with like just a treasury growing with natural assets and building up a natural asset-backed treasury, essentially, with the governance token kind of having governance over this, which, that's when it gets really fun. We can build anything from like a nature-backed currency to deciding to eventually like roll out a marketplace if we wanted to. But honestly, like that doesn't seem that exciting for some of the reasons we kind of talked about before, where like the carbon offset market itself doesn't get us to where we need to be. So if we ever needed to liquidate, it's good that we've vetted really, really high quality stuff that we can sell. But I don't think that's not the intent. But yeah, so I think there's a lot one can do once it has like a treasury full of like the highest quality stuff out there.
But does that assume that every project you invest in has like a Web3 native carbon credit issuance? Or are you assuming that there's some kind of bridge that is possible to take, a legacy credit and bring it on into Celo? Like, how does that work? Because I know you're partnering with Solid World, and just curious to understand. Like, there's a big divide right now because of the decision that Vera made recently to, ban the tokenization of retired credits without providing any key solution, and it looks like that might take a while. So, like, how is this going to look? Are you just assuming that the credit issuance will be Web3 native? Or are you, planning contingency if that isn't the case? Like, help us understand that piece of the puzzle.
Yes. I think we're going to see this is an explosion of like DMRV and automated verification solutions, which then is the massive primitive we need to have more end-to-end on-chain carbon credit issuance. If you're looking at a lot of the like legacy registries, a lot of the reason they're set up this way is to allow like in-person auditing and this like massive vetting process. I think as we move to more, remote monitoring that's automated, where all the data is coming in from various sources, we can skip a lot of that, and make that a lot thinner and have a lot less middlemen with a lot less like cuts along the way. And if that's a correct kind of view for the future of monitoring, I think it's only natural that like it becomes easier and easier to tokenize projects end to end. That said, we're not there yet, right? So like, what is this gap right now? And it means right now, we will be limiting to what we're buying to these tokenized projects. But there are plenty of startups that are working in this gap, right? They're working on taking projects off chain and issuing credits for them, and having their own kind of verification process, and partnering with those projects ends up being a really, really good fit. And they kind of then fall into our fun incentive game, where they can list projects on our platform that maybe don't have the more standard Vera or gold standard approval, but we can provide additional credibility to it because it goes through our review committee as well. And then driving liquidity to projects that are highly vetted, really, really good, but they don't fit into an existing methodology, and just driving more funding to the things that like don't fit into the system, I guess.
Super cool. I love how much you guys are pushing forward these frontiers, and I'd be curious to understand. Like, I know you mentioned a Climate Collective grant earlier. How else have you gotten funding? What have those conversations been like? And who do you find is most resonant with the vision of the future that you both seem to hold?
That's a fun question. So we decided to raise traditional like venture capital money in May, in addition to a few different like grant applications as well. Some of which are coming through this week, which is super exciting. Definitely the first time like going through like grant processes for Web3, and that was fun. But yeah, I think in terms of like who resonates the most, it's very much people who I guess have a full holistic picture of the climate problem, rather than and are very like long-term focused, right? So like what we're building, when it works, not if it works, when it works, returns will come like significantly in the future. So looking at people who, are truly mission aligned in like building a fundamentally like different world built on different primitives. And that message like has been pretty attractive so far. And what's interesting is that, we are reimagining very core incentives in our financial system. And that means that, a traditional investor might look at that and be kind of nervous. They're like, oh, are you messing up capitalism? Like, how am I going to get returns from this? But the thing is, if, we end up building a different capitalism, at least it'll be part of that, right? So that's, I guess, the flip side of why, traditional investors might want to like invest in like a ReFi startup, because it's like, what if, all these like ReFi companies like fork capitalism? Like, wouldn't you want to be a part of that? Don't you want a seat at that table?
So real. And I feel like, Helena, you've been like, there's been like little snippets, little glimpses of like how big this vision could be. Like, hey, like if we have a treasury, we have a nature-backed currency, like, like that, no problems with that. Like, I'm curious, in your biggest dream of what this could be and what it could look like to be in a reimagined capitalism, what comes up for you?
Kind of scared to answer that. I don't know who's listening.
Everyone. Or no one, whichever you are.
I mean, it's huge. I mean, if any of like, if you, I'm sure both of you have listened to read to Sacred Economics and like Ministry for the Future and delved into like Global Carbon Reward, but like actualizing what's like in those books, like that's what this is. And I think like nobody's really, at least nobody that we've kind of come across, right? If someone's out there like building out the Global Carbon Reward on chain, like come talk to me, like I want to be your best friend. But it's like actualizing those things and like creating the framework for this like movement shift, right? It's very much has to be a movement. Like if we want to build this like revised version of capitalism, we need people winning in the existing system to decide, hey, actually, I want to use a value-based currency. So to some extent, like, yes, we can go and build all these primitives, but until people believe that there can be and there should be a better way that isn't an extractive economy, it won't really work. But I think now, like in history, like we've seen more and more excitement by that than we've ever seen before. And that like is largely driven by like the state of the world in our climate crisis. But I think if we can kind of not front run, but get all those primitives ready, then we have a really, really good shot of like moving over people into the new and better world.
Yeah, it's almost as if, I think like it seems like also part of what you're really enabling and empowering is for people to have that choice of like, hey, here's an invitation into a different way of doing things. You have a choice, as for example, as a validator to be like, great, like this is something that we value and we're going to indicate that we value. And for those that also value the same thing, now be able to direct like through their dollars and through their economic flow. Great. Now we can actually like see that through into funding projects that are going to be actually, it's like that are reflecting a new paradigm around how we can exist in relationship with our planet, right? Am I getting that correctly?
Totally. Yep, totally. It's opt-in for the first time, right? Like you can opt in to a carbon tax. And if enough people opt in to this like value-based system, then that can make real world, changes in the world and in real world policy as well. So that's also kind of like adjacent to like Balaji's like network state kind of ideas around like opt-in and like community based, and like that's what this is, right? And that's pretty exciting.
And then also to create the flywheels on top of that like makes it fun and engaging and like keeps the engine going like as soon as you opt in.
Exactly.
Yeah, 100%. I think like we want people to see the portfolio, right? See the projects that are in spirals and get really, really excited about them and get rewarded for learning more about them and just get super pumped up about I think so much of what's in climate in the mainstream media is all doom and gloom, right? But at least for me, I got really excited around this big problem when I started meeting founders and startups and all this like ingenuity that's happening in this industry. And I think that is certainly one way to kind of reframe the narrative around, hey, like there's this big problem and it seems like not enough people are doing anything about it, to like, here are the heroes behind the scenes, right? Like here are their stories and here are all the interesting and fascinating ways that people are engineering biology and chemistry and just sort of reinventing what's possible. So, yeah.
And just touching into that kind of founder insight, I know, Doug, you live with a bunch of founders. You guys have started this Cello Circle for founders in ReFi, building on Cello. You all seem so deeply committed towards this entrepreneurial spirit. What are some of the things that have surprised you as you've engaged in this ecosystem of founders using Web3 to address climate change? Is there anything that comes up in particular?
I think it's been interesting stepping in and out of the ReFi bubble, because when you're in the ReFi bubble, it feels so good and it feels like home and it feels like family, right? But then you go to a barbecue and then you have to kind of break it down on so many levels, right? Like what is crypto? What is carbon markets? Why is this even necessary? Isn't blockchain bad for the environment? So on and so forth. So I think that's been like a, but then once you're able to share like some of those nuggets, right? Because so much of like the mainstream perception about Web3 is still stuck in kind of like NFTs and DeFi, and so it's really exciting to be a part of ReFi this early on. But I think that has been certainly one of the challenges is like depending on who you're talking to, a very different message strikes a very different chord. So you kind of have to like pick and choose your battles, or like choose that angle of framing that really works. And yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Helena.
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I don't think anyone has heard me describe spirals in the same way twice. When they tell you as a founder that like, your pitch is going to be different for every single person you're talking to, like with ReFi, that's like so fully embodied. Like it's vastly different. So that's been fun, it very much keeps you on your toes. For some of the people we've recently brought onto the team, they definitely have still been on-ramping onto that. We're like, how do I talk about what I do at work? And it's like, well, it depends. And that ends up kind of being the answer to most questions.
I know we've got just a few minutes here wrapping up, but I'd love to just touch on this one piece, which is how do you both be well in this place of being a founder of an early stage startup who've raised venture capital with a completely audacious vision for the future, with a lot on your plate? What are the practices that you both inhabit in your day-to-day life that ensures that you have a strong center and that, you know, you guys are building a regenerative culture at Spirals as you grow?
That's such a good question. You know, we had this mantra is, you know, like every day at 4 p.m., 5 p.m., like go touch some grass, right? And like it's like, you know, go step outside, right? Like especially if you haven't already. I think one thing that has worked really well for me, that actually one of my roommates shared with me is, on Saturdays he tries to keep his commitment level like as low as possible, right? It's like a me day, right? So I'm doing anything that makes me feel creative, and sort of enabled to like writing, reading, music stuff. And I just love that because it's such a relaxing way. And of course, like not every Saturday comes up like that. There's not always an opportunity to do that. But you know, that certainly has helped a lot. I think for me personally, I love going on walks and taking a step. It's like sometimes you're working on something for hours and you're like it's just not clicking. And then you step outside for like a second and then it comes to you, right? It's like, when it's clear like what you're looking for, sometimes you just have to like kind of take a step away, and then it really does come to you. And also, I think like we're involved in so many sort of circles, that it's really fascinating because I think there's always one person or maybe one person removed in the second degree network that has the answer, or someone that's like, you know, open to jam on something, right? And I think like I just want to give a shout out to like all the people that have been taking calls with me and Helena, whether it's jamming on like the governance or the tokenomics model, or Cello giving us a home, right? Like there's so many people that have supported us along the way that have made this possible. And like there's a lot happening behind the scenes, I guess, that like people don't see, right? And I think like in the ReFi kind of like intersection of culture between Web3 and climate, there's just so much beauty and goodness there, right? People are very happy to kind of partner and win together, because if you win, then we all win, right? Like, that's kind of the mindset.
That's beautiful. For those listening who deeply resonate with what you're doing, what can they do to get involved, to join you in this mission? I'll leave this one with you, Helena.
Yeah, I mean, follow us on Twitter. All of our DMs are open. We're Spirals Protocol. I'm Helena Merck, and then this is Douglas Kean, or Doug. And yeah, let's build a better world. Take the green pill. Let's go.
Awesome, friends.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Enjoy your founder circle. Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.